John Disco and Sci-Fi Steven started making music some mysterious time in probably the 80s, considering they're brothers. Worth mentioning now that Sci-Fi's full name is not Science Fiction Steven Disco, but they had your generic charlatans-esque haircuts and a band named Black Iron Skyline. The first and only fan of Black Iron Skyline was a girl called Amanda Wren. Well, Amanda McKinnon.
The very, very early days, me and John would just rehearse. First of all, in a place, the place was called Tower Studios, which is up in like Park Circus. But the only reason that we ever found out about it is, we just used to mess about in one of our bedrooms with like really like, I would just use a Casio keyboard that had an inbuilt drum machine with pre-coordinated rhythms. Like about 1990, I think. Like I remember just going around the record shops in the West End and finding this flyer, and it was like band practice Tower Studios. And I was like, right, we do it just so we can play really loud through. And so we'd take the Casio keyboard still and play it just really loud through the PAs, and we'd just play it far too loud. And we eventually blew up a couple of PAs just using a Casio keyboard. First rehearsal studio that we chose was Tower Studios, and that happened to be run by Craig Tannock, who now runs Mono Stereo 78 and everything. That's just a total accident, but we've stayed, from Craig Tannock's first rehearsal studio, just by complete accident. We were very like a part of the 13th Note scene when he took that over, like from the very beginning of the 13th Note. Tower Studios moved to Apollo, which is now the Flying Duck, but Apollo in the early 90s was like 3 rehearsal rooms in a little venue. So we would so we just go there to rehearsal, but because they had a venue inbuilt, like it was more like, oh, you should play. By this time we had a drum machine, and we sounded a bit more like fuller or whatever. With my voice had broken, and we just sounded kind of, I don't know, synth pop indie whatever. But the point is, there was a venue attached to the rehearsal studios, and so eventually by about 1992, I think I'd just turned 16, and we were allowed to play in the venue, but we were only allowed to play on a Sunday afternoon. Because he couldn't sell any alcohol because John was underage.
I love that.
So that was our very first proper gig as Black Iron Skyline, as we were then. Somebody's got a tape of it somewhere. Probably one of those things that I really want to hear, but actually I don't. You know what I mean? It's like, I mean, we've still got a demo tape that we did in 1991 in the old Tower Studios, which just sounds like The Shaman or something.
She started dating Steven, and with hanging around them, she joined the band, which ended up being called Biss. The first single was Transmissions on the Teensy tip, which gives you a pretty good introduction to Biss. The art is already pretty much exactly what it would end up being. With Manda's cut and paste zine style, this cover has the earliest designs of the band's characters, and John wouldn't always look like there's no other way Damon Albarn. The EP opens with the perfect Kill Your Boyfriend, probably the OG Biss classic and one of the most Riot Girl style songs they've ever written. Overall, this is a solid Biss EP, but Kill Your Boyfriend is by far the best song on the record. The design is really cool, featuring a gatefold, which is really interesting. It came out through a Spanish label, which I won't try and pronounce, but the guy who signed them had picked up Steven's Paper Bullet zine on a trip to Edinburgh. The title comes from Steven liking the word teensy, and the release happened at the original 13th Note on Glassford Street, and had been recorded a year before in 1994. Disco Nation 45 came pretty soon after and was recorded at the Practice Pad, the same as Teensy Tip, but this time they were signed to the Delgados as Chemical Underground. The song on Disco Nation is School Disco, another song that came from Manda. It was around this point that Biss had solidly developed their approach to lyrics. Everything was simple and happy, talking about things like growing up as an nerdy teenager, which is exactly what School Disco was about. Everything gets way more interesting with the release of the next EP, the Secret Vampire soundtrack. The opening track is a song called Candy Pop, which outside of the Powerpuff Girls theme, which comes later, is probably the most well-known Best song. The single isn't called Candy Pop, so they definitely lost sales after being invited to Top of the Pops to play it. People would have been in Woolworths asking for Candy Pop, not realising that it was actually on an EP called The Secret Vampire Soundtrack. They were invited onto Top of the Pops because the producer had came across one of their CDs and liked it. This happened midway through opening for the Super Furry Animals. The Glasgow date of the Super Furries tour would land at King Tut's Wah Wah Hut. After the Top of the Pops performance, the Secret Vampire Soundtrack got to 25 on the charts, and they were invited back on because they were actually on the charts this time. The big guys at the press really did not like a young talented band who weren't laddish, and things started getting even more crazy. The NME cover is fine apart from Stephen's hair, but that doesn't mean that they didn't get an actual death threat printed, which called them Evil Cabbage Patch Kids, which is really creative actually. Despite this, they headlined the Doc Martens stage at Reading Festival in 1997 and 2 slots down on the NME stage in 1996. They played Tea in the Park in 1996 where Stephen wore an entire Air United kit. Around this time, record labels became interested, and they ended up looking for a label in America, where Grand Royal was interested. Grand Royal was a really good fit for Bess, not only because it was run by the actual Beastie Boys, mainly Mike D, but because they had such similar music and views to several of the bands on the label. Most bands were influenced by punk and electronic music, and combined this with punk and feminist politics. One of the most known artists on Grand Royal was Luscious Jackson, including Beastie Boy herself, Kate Schellenbach, and Ad Rock's friend, Jill Kniff. In 1997, Mike D spoke in Melody Maker about signing Bess. He mentioned that he wanted them after Bikini Kill came back from the UK so excited about them. After the release of 2 further EPs, the debut album started coming together and Bess Mania hit Japan in 1997. They never tried to have a specific aesthetic, but similarly to Urusei Yatsura, their style was inspired by Japanese manga. Manda's art style was an absolute hit in Japan, and she even got her own comic in a magazine. Their album, The New Transistor Heroes, made number 55 in the UK, but number 19 in Japan. The album sold 100,000 copies in Japan, and they even had their own Baby G watch. Japan was crazy for Bess in 1997. The same cannot be said for a year later in 1998. Tell It to the Kids is a perfect start to the album, and I think it flows really well into Sweet Shop Avengers, where Stephen says the iconic "Hi, we're Bess" from Glasgow, Scotland, and the song is pretty much classic early Bess. The next track, Starbright Boy, by far has the best music video. The song is literally just about wanting to be in an 80s movie, and the video is set up perfectly. The setting is Biscuit Records, a struggling record store threatened with closure by the big boss man. Eventually, the band play a benefit show and the shop is saved, and all is happy. Also, John Hughes wants to make a film out of it. I think a lot of people would look at this era of Bess and call it their peak. But after this, there were 4 other albums and an entire band along with various side projects.
This was the start of how we get back to the modern present day Bess is basically somehow deciding in 2018 to start actually just turning songs that we'd kind of sort of worked on with vague, we'd sort of on and off reunion, just kind of we'll do one-off gigs and blah blah blah, and the odd song comes through. Manda had done a solo album way back. I'd done a couple of Batteries records, which sold, if you can sell less than 0 copies of something, then I think it was the industry first.
Honestly, it's impressive that after a weird hate campaign from the press as teenagers and putting so much work in just to be dropped from labels in the end, that they are still here.
I kind of hope, and I kind of in some ways expect that some more people will realise and find out about this band, and it's encouraging when people like yourself do, even if it's you're a drop in the ocean. It's just I think we were a mental, unique band. Just a totally unique band that eventually will, we might not be pioneers of anything, but they'll just be if you keep going, you keep the awareness there, and it's I don't expect to be, touring the world ever again or whatever, but just to be just want a few more people to be Bess, they were much better than you give them credit for, or whatever. That's all it is. Or indeed, Bess who still don't know who they are. That's also fine.
Bess are mainstays of the Glasgow scene, and I will never believe that Glasgow music could be the same without them. Bess are still touring with more confidence and less rabid journalists, and you can see them play with Jesus Jones and EMF in October.
Somebody wrote the Bible. That's not non-fiction either. So there you go.
Do you think they're still getting royalties? Like their descendants?
God.